at public knowledge of the fact that you have not been invited to Little Rock to consult with the President-elect, so that your secret is safe with us and you will not be embarrassed. I'm particularly delighted to be introducing this evening Leon Aron, one of our newest colleagues at the American Enterprise Institute. For many years before coming to AEI early this year, he was Salvatore Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and he is, during the current year, in addition to being a resident scholar here at AEI, also a fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Leon was born and raised in Moscow and received his BA in English philology from Moscow State Pedagogical Institute. Came to the United States in 1978. In 1983, he became an American citizen. In 1985, he received his PhD in political sociology from Columbia University. And since then, and I think especially in the past 3 or 4 years, he has become quite widely known around the United States, both in generally through articles in all of the major national newspapers and frequent appearances on television, and among academic specialists through many of his writings in academic journals, as one of the most perceptive students of the unfolding social and economic and political story in Russia. A very recent article, which I'd recommend to those who have not seen it, is his article, "The Battle for the Soul of Russian Foreign Policy," in the current issue of the American Enterprise, which is available in the anteroom, where we will have a reception after his lecture. His lecture is titled Boris Yeltsin, the Founding Father. It may be regarded as a sneak preview of the political biography of Yeltsin that Leon is currently working on. The last chapter of that story has yet to be written in both senses of the term, but it is a subject that Leon has thought a great deal about and has given several talks on amongst his colleagues here at AEI, and the book is going to be a very important milestone when it appears, and we're delighted that he has come here this afternoon to give you some of the analysis that will be the centerpiece of this biography. Leon Aron, please.
Thank you very much, Chris, for this very generous introduction. Boris Yeltsin burst upon the world in a flurry of television images from a tank-ridden Moscow in the early morning of August 19th, 1991. He strode alone and defenseless to a tank whose guns were trained on the Russian parliament, shook hands with the astonished crew, and proceeded to read from atop the tank a decree defying the hardline communist plotters. Yet long before Yeltsin had become a fixture on Western television screens, his place in Russian history had been firmly secured by a series of dramatic political firsts. The first top party functionary to resign openly and publicly from the Communist Party leadership, the first former communist leader to owe his life exclusively to the voters, the first freely elected Russian chief executive in that country's history, the first Russian, alive or dead, to run in 3 consecutive national elections in 3 years, the first Russian leader to accept and indeed to promote the collapse of the empire, but perhaps most importantly, the first Russian, with the possible exception of Alexander II, who attempted to modernize Russia, not by modernizing and perfecting the apparatus of the state, but by, in fact, decreasing the state's involvement in the life of the people. As he put it in his opening speech to the Congress of People's Deputies of Russia that has just finished its work, for the first time we are embarking on dedicated work to pave the way for citizens to develop their initiative and entrepreneurial skills, not by issuing commands and threats, but by developing and ensuring effective motivation. There has been nothing like that in Russia. He's right, there hasn't been. From 1989 on, faster and better than any Russian politician, Yeltsin sensed the direction of the rapidly unfolding Russian public opinion. When he articulated it and when he began to capitalize on it, he became, in effect, Russia's first modern politician. The great Russian 20th century poet, Anna Akhmatova, once said that her dear friend Boris Pasternak looked both like an Arab thoroughbred and its Arab rider, the driver and the driven. Both the toxin of the upcoming storm and the force within the storm itself. Yeltsin is essential to any history of a Russian revolution. He is indispensable to the description of its key moments. That revolution so far, I believe, had 4 stages. The first one might be called the glorious revolution from above. It was unleashed by Gorbachev in 1985 and lasted through 1989. In Gorbachev's once famous but now long forgotten phrase, the purpose of that revolution was to scrub the Soviet system clean of the alluvia and the sediment on the healthy body of socialism. That phase reached its apogee with Yeltsin's resignation from the position of the first secretary of the Communist Party in Moscow on October 21st, 1987. During the second phase, which lasted approximately from 1989 through the fall of 1990, the revolution transcended its origins as an intramural affair between the party and the intelligentsia and burst upon the streets. This phase began with the election of Yeltsin, ostracized and vilified only 18 months before, to the Congress of People's Deputies of the USSR on March 26, 1989. Yeltsin's presence marked virtually every high point of that second phase of the revolution. The organization of the interregional group of radical deputies, for all intents and purposes, the first loyal opposition since 1916. Yeltsin became the chairman of that group together with Andrei Sakharov, Viktor Palm, Yuri Afanasyev, and Gavril Popov. There followed the election of Yeltsin to the chairmanship of the Supreme Soviet of Russia. Then there was the declaration of Russian sovereignty, which Yeltsin engineered. There followed Yeltsin's exit from the Communist Party a month later, and yet in another month there was the famous agreement with Gorbachev on the 500-day program. This period ended in October 1990, when Gorbachev, in effect, broke his pact with Yeltsin. In the words of a Russian journalist, democracy surpassed its erstwhile leader, Gorbachev, flowed around him like a stream around a stone, and he remained suddenly aged in the rear guard of the army. The third stage of the revolution was launched by Yeltsin's surprise trip to the Baltics on January 13, 1991, after the Soviet crackdown in Lithuania. It was colored by the increasingly broad-based and strident anti-communism. Its high point was a demonstration of about 500,000 people on the last day of March 1991 in support of Yeltsin, who at the time was threatened by the impeachment of in the Russian parliament. And then there followed on June 13 of 1991 Yeltsins' victory in the field of 4 candidates in the Russian presidential elections, in which he campaigned on the platform of a radical market reform and multi-party democracy. The fourth and the current stage of the revolution, contrary to the widespread perception, was not launched in the morning of August 19, but a month before then, when Yeltsin signed a decree forbidding political organizations at the workplace. It was that blow to the heart of the party that prompted the reluctant plotters to move a month later. Today, Robert Louis Stevenson once said, is the obscurest of epochs. And in historic terms, Yeltsin is barely out of today. Still, before the scholarly histories are written, at least one ingredient of Yeltsin's success seems to be beyond doubt. And that is that alone among Russians, Russian leaders, past or present, Yeltsin was instantaneously and intensely recognized by the Russians as one of their own. No one before this son of a bricklayer and the grandson of a peasant from the Ural village, no Tsar, no Lenin, and neither Sakharov nor Solzhenitsyn could claim the extent and intensity of this popular identification. Through the centuries, the Russian people left politics to them, они, the intelligentsia, the nobility, who argued with one another, censored one another, sent one another into exile and the firing squad. But the Russian people stood by, mute, watching. As Alexander Pushkin finished his immortal tragedy, Boris Godunov, with the words, "People are silent, народ безмолвствует." The uniqueness of what the Russian political observers rightly call the Yeltsin phenomenon is in fact that Yeltsin has given the people somewhat of a voice. Until then, the Russian people participated in the political process only as two sorts of actors, executioners and martyrs. And it's with that voice, decidedly unpolished after 70 years of silence, hardly melodious, often off-key, that Yeltsin began to speak. Of this century political leaders, Yeltsin most closely resembles General de Gaulle. Both began their national careers as outsiders, a tank commander in Alsace and a party functionary in the Urals. Both followed the road to supreme power, not through any gradual raise through established institutions, but by arriving through some honorable intuition at a decision quite honest and remarkably moral, but seemingly suicidal politically, to break with their milieu, the political and military establishment of Russia and France. Both rebelled against their former patrons and mentors, Mikhail Gorbachev and Marshal Pétain. Both were called upon to deal with a reactionary coup d'etat. Both battled legislatures full of militant leftists. Both displayed physical courage that few of the modern political leaders ever have a chance to display. De Gaulle, writes Jean Le Couture, did his very best as a rebel. There's no better description of Yeltsin. With characteristically casual brilliance, Leon Aron wrote in his memoirs that de Gaulle's June 18, 1940 appeal to resistance was the expression of authentic France still unaware of itself. Yeltsin's speech at the party plenum on October 21st, 1987 too, was an authentic expression of Russia, still unaware of the collapse of the last stage of its communist civilization, Gorbachev's version of the socialism with a human face. Like de Gaulle, Yeltsin proved superb in playing for years a weak hand. Both were kept alive, but politically emaciated by the dominant figures of the day, Churchill and Gorbachev, who disliked them intensely, but kept them around for very clear-cut purposes. Churchill to secure French empire, particularly French Northern Africa, for the Allies. And Gorbachev, well, Gorbachev used Yeltsin the way Perseus used the head of Medusa. He reached into the bag, produced Yeltsin, and the conservative wing of the party froze in fear. By comparison, Gorbachev seemed supremely reasonable, very moderate, and all of a sudden highly worthy of support. While professing loyalty to their allies, both men managed to sustain their political independence, no mean feat, and gradually convert their political beachheads into nationwide following. They both claimed legitimacy rather than waited for it to be conferred. One cannot help recalling yet another parallel between Yeltsin and de Gaulle, and that is the treatment they received, at least initially, in the official Washington. And I should indulge this thought. From London and Vichy, the US diplomats reported that de Gaulle was an apprentice Hitler, mad, provocateur, and a viper whom that great French patriot Marshal Pétain nourished on his bosom. The French, who had the Roosevelt administration's ear, warned incessantly of de Gaulle's Caesarism and authoritarian tendencies. Well, that must sound familiar, and indeed it is, because Yeltsin, too, has been treated by the official Washington what the New York Times aptly described as ill-conceived derision. He has been called a populist, a demagogue, and often, for a good measure, populist demagogue. That fixture of highbrow television news shows, Professor Jerry Hoff of Duke and Brookings labeled Yeltsin proto-fascist. Year in and year out, Yeltsin has been dismissed by unnamed, but always senior administration officials as a lightweight and a bore to boot. Every August, with remarkable regularity, the newspaper stories filed from Kennebunkport invariably contained expressions of grave concern by the same senior but unnamed official, disturbed by Yeltsin authoritarian tendencies, unpredictability, lack of strategy, and of understanding. It has been Yeltsin's misfortune, and perhaps Russia's tragedy, that the Russian Revolution coincided with one of the least revolutionary White Houses in Washington's history. Its reaction to Yeltsin was utter bewilderment. By contrast, Gorbachev, a machine politician par excellence, polished by a gradual rise through the nomenclatura ranks and by access to finer things in life, was both familiar and likable, a kind of sister plant on the other side of the ideological divide. Even after Yeltsin became the first democratically elected leader in Russian history, 2 months before the ground cave-in under Gorbachev, his visit to Washington had to be handled with utmost care. When he arrived in June of 1991, the highest official meeting him at the airport was his Washington host, Senator Bob Dole. The highlight of the visit was the strictly private dinner at the Kennedy Center. And there, amidst backslapping and sophomoric jokes about whose tie was better, the official Washington paid homage to the leader of the nonviolent anti-communist revolution in the Soviet Union. But perhaps the key parallel between de Gaulle and Yeltsin is the nature of their political base. At every critical juncture, both of them turned to and derived their strength from not any established political structures, but from some mysterious vox populi that at times only they seem to discern in the hostile and deafening din. Even after both had acquired supreme power, becoming first popularly elected chief executives in the French and Russian history, both continued to appeal with undiminished effectiveness to the same audience. Their ultimate political tool has been not the government, not the party, but France and Russia. Of course, de Gaulle lived by and died by, or rather self-administered a political death by a referendum. It was inevitable that sooner or later Yeltsin would come to that, and indeed he is preparing a referendum of his own even as we speak. Both Yeltsin and de Gaulle came to power in their nations at a time of very acute and pervasive national humiliation. They endeavored to guide Russia and France through a period of very painful adjustment to sudden and brutal limits imposed on those nations by history. Yeltsin's task, of course, is much harder than de Gaulle's was. From Ivan the Terrible through Catherine the Great, Peter, Lenin, Stalin, Brezhnev, the paradigm of Russian state building always included these three components: rearmament, strengthening and modernization of state, and foreign expansion. Yeltsin has revised, or attempted to revise, all three. He sharply reduced the defense appropriations, seeking armed forces about a third of what they were under the Soviet Union. He reversed the 400-year-old political tradition in which the Russian national idea was synonymous with the Russian imperial idea. Yeltsin appears to determine to create nothing else but a new national purpose. He's waking Russia from the age-old solemn dream and teaches it to speak prose. In his opening speech to this Congress that has just ended, he said, "For the first time, work is acquiring a value in itself, not for the world revolution, not for the state, not for the glorious future, but for oneself and for the prosperity of one's family and kin. I'm convinced that this is a powerful foundation for the moral regeneration of our people." Yeltsin's credo is gloriously pedestrian. He said, "To change life in Russia and embark on the road to civilized development, which has been trodden for ages by other nations, such ambition is deeply rooted in my heart and soul. I want my people to enjoy better and freer lives under the rule of law." He said that in an interview a year ago, just embarking on his economic revolution. And apparently he continues to believe it, because in the same speech that I already quoted, he said, "The fact that we lead the planet in numbers of missiles is not a fact we should be proud of. Rather, the fact that we have an affluent, quiet, dynamic, and secure life created by peaceful labor. This is my dream of Russia's future." Finally, like de Gaulle, Yeltsin guided his nation through a painful separation with Ukraine, which, like Algeria was for France, was much more than a colony, the core reference point in the national identity, part of the national mythology. Both accomplished this against a violent resistance of the nationalist military. Barely 5 months into independent Russian foreign policy, the Serbian crisis came along, as if to tempt Yeltsin and Russia again with the gilded apple of pan-Slavism. Russians could have abstained easily, but they voted for the resolution of the Security Council, which imposed very severe economic sanctions on Serbia, like Russia, a Greek Orthodox Slavic nation, fighting Muslim Bosnians and Catholic Croats, a country whose dignity Russia fought in World War I to protect. We know that Moscow agonized over that decision until the last moment, but confronted for the first time with a clear choice between the resurrection of a very powerful nationalist ideology of the past and siding with the West. Yeltsin chose the latter. So far, Yeltsin also has avoided two other temptations out of Russian history: to base one's security on the insecurity of your neighbors, and to gain international recognition by the sheer magnitude of your military threat to them. When Yeltsin pulled the rug from under the Soviet Union and created the Commonwealth of Independent States, I believe he was aiming at least three objectives. First, to get rid once and for all of Gorbachev's communist center. Secondly, to manage Ukraine's exit from the Union. And third, to collect nuclear weapons spread on the territory of the former Soviet Union under the Russian roof. He more or less succeeded in all three. But I think what was the most ingenious and perhaps most impressive in this operation was the fact that Yeltsin managed to do all this without arousing fears of renewed Russian imperialism. And so from the very first step, a new Russia won respect, albeit very much tempered by historic memory, a respect of the civilized world. That Yeltsin finished off perestroika and its founder, Mikhail Gorbachev, is well known. Forgotten is that Yeltsin did more to help Gorbachev to launch his glorious revolution from above than any other party functionary, with a possible exception of Alexander Yakovlev. The post of the first secretary of the Communist Party Committee of Moscow, which made Yeltsin the absolute master of the Soviet capital and the leader of the largest party organization in the country. That post was traditionally given by the General Secretary to somebody he trusted and somebody he valued above all. In Yeltsin's case, I believe Gorbachev was guided by something else as well. All Russian revolutions started in the capitals, Moscow or St. Petersburg. I believe Gorbachev wanted Yeltsin to start one. And start one he did, with a bang. On January 25th, 1986, barely a month into his tenure as the Moscow party chief, Yeltsin convened his first city party conference. Following the tradition, the conference took place in one of the prettiest pre-revolutionary buildings in Moscow, what used to be called the House of Noblemen's Conventions, and what at the time already had a different name. It was called the Hall of Columns of the House of the Trade Unions. Now, the name changed, but the substance proved remarkably resilient. That place continued to be the Hall of Noblemen's Conventions. The nobility changed, and the nobility were the party bureaucrats. And the gathering, those types of gatherings were quite popular with them, because the nomenclatura took time to rest from the rigors of governing, enjoy a buffet stocked with delicacies unavailable even in their special canteens, browse through the books that one could not buy anywhere in the country, flirt with a pretty comrade in an imported red finished dress, and snooze quietly through the speeches. Yeltsin woke them up. Not since the 1920s, when Stalin burned out the last vestiges of frankness in the inter-party dialogue, had the august hall of columns heard anything like that. With the entire Politburo present and Gorbachev presiding, Yeltsin told the over 1,000 delegates at the conference that the atmosphere of ostentatiousness, exaggeration of success, and concealment of shortcomings has penetrated the work of the Moscow party organization. Money grabbing, thievery, and bribe-taking were daily pursuits of many people, Yeltsin claimed. A month later, at the 27th Party Congress, he renewed his attack. Now, the date of the opening of that Congress was timed by Gorbachev to the day to coincide with the famous 20th Party Congress 30 years ago in 1956, at which Khrushchev made his famous de-Stalinization secret speech. And still, it was not Gorbachev's speech at that Congress, but Yeltsin's that was by far the most radical. Why, Yeltsin demanded, have we not been able to root out social injustice and abuse of power? Why is it that even now the demand for radical change is bogged down in the inert layer of time servers among the party cadres? Yeltsin called for the periodic accounts of the party leadership to the rank and file. He also, and he was the first one ever, to publicly call for the end of the privileges, non-monetary remuneration of the party elite. That was the first time that that issue, that 2 years hence would become the battle cry of the first phase of the revolution, was raised publicly. Yeltsin did something else that no one out of the 5,000 delegates at the Congress did. He uttered the first public mea culpa ever by the high party official. He said, "Delegates may ask why I did not say all this in my speech to the 26th Party Congress, which took place in 1981. I can answer, and answer frankly, that I lacked sufficient courage." When the Congress closed with the singing of the Internationale, Yeltsin returned to his battle for Moscow. He confronted in Moscow all the things that later would confound and slow down the revolution: the insolence, incompetence, and petty viciousness of bureaucrats of all ranks, the servility of the people, and the endless talk and squabbles of the intelligentsia. Yeltsin began his Moscow tenure thinking like Gorbachev, that his task was to rid the healthy garden of socialism of a few nefarious rodents. He found himself instead chasing in vain the many tails of a huge and silent animal that nested deep inside Russia. That animal was the system. 2 years later, in a privately videotaped interview, which I was very fortunate to see, Yeltsin compared his and Gorbachev's effort to trying to empty a bottomless bucket of mud with your bare hands. And Yeltsin was very expressive in this interview. He pointed his hands down and plunged them into the imaginary bucket full of mud, and he said, "You take a full load, you throw the mud out, you even see the bottom, and the next moment the bucket is full again." But not all was in vain. In the spring of 1986, several months into Yeltsin's tenure, 2 Moscow newspapers, Moskovskoye Pravda and Moskovsky Komsomolets, began to treat astonished Muscovites to stories about mafia, drug addiction, prostitution, this time to refer to their socialist reality rather than rotting West. And lacking words after the enforced silence to describe these newly acknowledged vices, the Russian journalists turned to the American terminology: kidnapping, крестный отец, the godfather, отмывание денег, money laundering, and so on and so forth. Soon there were more stories about poverty, hunger, homelessness, the disastrous state of healthcare. And the astonished Muscovites did not know what to call this sudden crack in the official wall of lies. Later, the name was found, glasnost. It proved to be the most important and the only lasting legacy of Gorbachev's glorious revolution from above. And it all began under Yeltsin in Moscow in 1986. On October 21st, 1987, Yeltsin publicly resigned from the post of the first secretary of the Moscow City Party Committee, citing the lack of revolutionary change and the incipient cult of Gorbachev. That was the first sign ever that Gorbachev's attempt to graft a human face on the rotting trunk of Soviet socialism was failing. In retrospect, Yeltsin's descent from the party Olympus was timed with the precision that history grants only to its favorites. Had he rebelled a year earlier, he would have vanished, perhaps sent into retirement, or, if lucky, made ambassador to Mongolia. Had he declared himself a year later, the Russians would have rightly judged him yet another fat nomenclatura rat that is jumping off the sinking ship. At the time, though, his rebellion was so breathtakingly novel, so courageous, that it instantaneously won him the admiration and devotion of the people who remained with him since. Yeltsin's political resurrection, his landslide victory in the March 1989 elections to the first semi-free Russian Soviet parliament, the Congress of People's Deputies of the USSR, marked the beginning of the second stage of the Russian Revolution. It was a stage where the revolution began to take on a life of its own. It was no longer easily managed by its self-appointed revolutionary-in-chief, Mikhail Gorbachev. There's one story, and one story only, that would prove worth your telling. These lines of Robert Graves are as applicable to effective politics as they are to good poetry. Reinventing himself at the age of 58 as a Democrat, Yeltsin found his story to tell. And that story, of course, was the story that he had started telling at the party congress 2 years before. It was a story of the non-monetary remuneration of the party and government elites. No feeling was wider or more intensely shared by the people than the hatred of those privileges. All those special drug stores, bookstores, department stores, grocery stores, ticket offices, special hospitals, special food processing plants, and even special farms on which that food was grown. And he relentlessly told that story, and by doing so, he forged something that the Russian political scene had not seen ever before. The united front of the intelligentsia and the people, united in their hatred of the rapacity of the party elite and in its belief in Yeltsin's honesty. When together with Sakharov, Afanasyev, Popov, and Palm, Yeltsin formed the interregional group of People's Deputies in the first Soviet parliament, it was, for all intents and purposes, a loyal opposition to Gorbachev. The revolution began to run not behind Gorbachev, not even alongside of him, but slightly ahead. Daily contacts with the leading radical intellectuals of the time would prove invaluable education for Yeltsin, and in time would turn him from a communist with a human face to a Democrat. Yeltsin, the harbinger, was becoming part of the gathering storm. In March of 1990, the intra-elite phase of the revolution was drawing to a close. The political fault lines began to shift from the highest councils of the party and the government and into a different battlefield. The battlefield where the combatants were the party officials, both liberal and conservative on the one side, and the forces of radical democratic revolution on the other. On May 29th, 1990, Yeltsin was elected by a 4-vote majority the chairman of the Supreme Soviet of Russia, the nominal head of the Russian state. 2 weeks later, Russia adopted the Declaration of Sovereignty, making its laws superior to those of the Soviet Union and taking control of its natural resources. For Yeltsin, May 29, 1990, was a watershed separating a bomb thrower, a party maverick, sort of a party Robin Hood, from a masterful and formidable politician. On that day, he parlayed his year-old rebellion from a quirk of history, a magnificent footnote, into a formidable and later dominant presence on the Russian scene. For Russia, Yeltsin's election heralded the arrival of the essential ingredients of democracy, compromise, and coalition building. At a press conference at the end of that first Congress of Russian People's Deputies in June of 1990, the proud Yeltsin told journalists that now there were 30 different factions registered in Russian parliament. Yeltsin, beaming, announced that no longer we were a gray monolith, but a bright multiplicity of colors. He added, the political opposition inside the Russian parliament is a reality, and we have to work with that opposition. Few, if any, of those present in the hall that day thought that they, in their lifetime, they would hear such words uttered in Russian. More important still, the Congress marked Yeltsin's rather successful attempt to marry Russian nationalism and Russian democracy. The reemergence of Russia from the deep shadow of the Soviet Union coincided at the Congress with the emergence of Russian democracy. Engineering this coincidence of resurgent Russian nationalism and democracy, the coincidence that is immensely benign for Russia and for its neighbors and for the world, was one of Yeltsin's most critical, perhaps the most critical contribution to the foundation of a new Russian state. In the early morning of January 13, 1991, in Lithuania's capital, Vilnius, the special troops of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of the Soviet Union shot their way in the television studio, killing 13 unarmed defenders. 2 hours later, Yeltsin was on a plane to neighboring Tallinn, the capital of Estonia. There, huddled in the Estonian parliament, surrounded by barricades manned by people with kitchen knives and hunting guns and expecting an attack any time, the presidents of Russia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia issued a declaration condemning the Vilnius action and affirming Baltic sovereignty. Between the Black Berets of the special troops of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Baltic people, Yeltsin placed the only shield he had, his popularity. A day later, a member of the Estonian parliament told his colleagues, if Yeltsin had not supported Estonia, I'm not sure we would be meeting here today. After signing the declaration, Yeltsin piled in a small car with a bodyguard and 3 aides and drove from Tallinn to Leningrad because his friends in the KGB advised him that it was not safe to fly. After driving all night from Leningrad to Moscow on January 14, Yeltsin arrived at the building of the Russian parliament to give perhaps the most memorable press conference of his lifetime. That press conference, scandalously unreported in the West, was the harbinger of a new democratic opposition to a newly reactionary Gorbachev regime. As Yeltsin said it on that day, we're witnessing a struggle for the survival of democracy. On January 14, Boris Yeltsin became the new movement's indisputed leader, making the Russian parliament the headquarters of a new opposition. The third stage of the Russian Revolution had commenced. Hoarse, red-eyed, his face deeply creased after 2 sleepless nights, Yeltsin opened the press conference with the appeal to the Russian soldiers in the Baltics. Despite, or perhaps because, of some wooden bureaucratisms that crept into that speech from Yeltsin's apparatchik's past, it was perhaps the most moving document of Yeltsin's political life. Before you storm non-military installations on the Baltic soil, remember your own hearth, the present and the future of your own republic, your own people. We're sure that the healthy forces in the army will not let it start down the anti-people road of support for the reaction. We believe in you, officers and soldiers of Russia, for whom, as for the previous generation of Russian warriors, the highest moral values live on: honor, valor, courage, allegiance to the people and the fatherland. Rarely does the significance of a political act differ so wildly from how it was originally read and perceived than Yeltsin's trip to the Baltics. The West ignored it completely. But even the Russian political commentators and journalists with whom I talked at the time in Moscow thought that it was a foolish waste of political capital, that was an act of desperation. They were convinced that Yeltsin had unnecessarily annoyed the Russian people, who, it was widely assumed, wanted to see the ungrateful Lithuanians punished. Yet once again, ahead of the pundits and journalists and pollsters, Yeltsin sensed what might be called a geological shift in Russia's mood. Russia's national identity was no longer fused with the Russian colonial empire. And if the empire was the price to pay to get rid of communism, so be it. At no other time was Yeltsin's personal fate and that of the Russian Revolution had been fused as closely or as precariously as in the first 3 months of 1991. With Gorbachev's silent approval, his Prime Minister Valentin Pavlov began relentlessly to roll back the achievements of Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost was kept alive barely by a few newspapers that expected to get closed down any minute. One felt scared and numb and caught in a time warp. It was as if one lived again through the propaganda blast that followed the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. Without the ability to respond to the torrent of accusation against him in the state-controlled media, Yeltsin for a while was silent. The mood among the Moscow intelligentsia, who after Vilnius incidentally began to fully trust Yeltsin, was utter despair. They were prepared for months, if not years, of reaction. The Second Russian Revolution appeared to be going the way the first one went, the revolution of 1917, which was cut short by a Bolshevik coup. The conventional wisdom, echoed by Yeltsin's advisors at the time, was to cut losses, lie low, and wait for the worst to pass. Instead, Yeltsin followed what had become his motto. It's a Russian proverb, klin klinom vyshybayut. To knock out one wedge, use another. When under attack, attack. On February 19th, Yeltsin, in the first and only television interview he had an opportunity to have, called upon the Russian people to dissociate themselves from Gorbachev, and 3 weeks later he declared a war on the Kremlin. Once more, Yeltsin's political instincts proved to be correct. If he had kept silent, the regime could have opted for the creeping recentralization, the salami technology of repression, cutting Glasnost piece by piece here, closing down a paper, a local Soviet, arresting someone there. But Yeltsin was there, big, stubborn, unwieldy, and immensely popular. And he dramatically narrowed at the time the choices available to the regime. The choices that he presented the regime with were an all-union crackdown, a kind of a Tiananmen Square on a large scale, or retreat. Arresting Yeltsin would not have done it, because within hours millions would have been on the street. The only way out of the deadlock was to murder Yeltsin and then follow up with a very ruthless crackdown. And so in winter of 1991, Yeltsin raised the stakes to a height that the regime could not or would not hurdle. And so on the eve of the emergency session of the Supreme Soviet of Russia, 500,000 people demonstrated against the Supreme Soviet in support of Yeltsin, ignoring Gorbachev's call and prohibition of demonstrations and ignoring thousands of stormtroops throughout the city. The people came to defend Yeltsin and their revolution, and once again both survived. Having failed to impeach Yeltsin and facing a revolt in his own party, Gorbachev wanted to talk again. And so on April 23rd, at the government dacha in Novo-Ogarevo, Yeltsin and Gorbachev cut their second and last deal. Yeltsin promised to end the nationwide strike of miners who were demanding Gorbachev's resignation, and Gorbachev, in all probability, promised not to interfere in the presidential elections in Russia. Both kept their word, and the road to August 19 was open. Early in Perestroika, when asked what sort of state, what sort of country they wanted, the Russian intellectuals used to say "Нормальная страна," the normal country, the normal land. And the movement towards that normalcy is Yeltsin's undeniable achievement of the last year. For the first time in almost 70 years, slowly and awkwardly, the Russian economy is reaching out to Russian citizens. It is doing so, to be sure, after 7 decades of paralysis, and that paralysis disfigured those fingers of the economy, made them not terribly elegant and often dirty. Still, it is beginning to touch the ordinary citizens, unlike that strange monster suspended in the air called the socialist economy, which sucked in labor and resources and spewed out garbage. Real prices were bringing real products. And consumer choice, the backbone of human dignity and economic democracy, is still limited and uneven, but it is real. Russia is becoming normal also because it is opening up itself to the outside world, immensely rich and exciting. And it's not doing so through a KGB-controlled détente of the 1970s, but through the most reliable things such as Mexican soap operas, CNN, MTV, through traveling to what is advertised in local newspapers as mysterious Cyprus and romantic Spain, through receiving Federal Express packages. Another sign of normalcy is the people's visible awareness of Russian messianism. That is another undeniable achievement of the last 12 months. They're more interested in helping their families, themselves, their block, perhaps their town, than in how to change the world. This political apathy, of course, is loudly bemoaned by the Russian intelligentsia, just as similar episodes of apathy are bemoaned by their Western colleagues in their own countries. And for the first time in the last 200 years, Russian literature is drifting away from Russian politics. This is, of course, good for the art. It's very bad for the intelligentsia, who are no longer taken seriously by the state and no longer are invited to stand behind the throne and advise the king as to what is good and what is bad for the people. But most fundamentally, Russia is becoming normal because it is finally succumbing to an orderly anarchy. This is a break not only with the 70 years of Soviet totalitarianism, but also with the centuries of Russian tradition. In this introduction to the great dialogues of Plato, W.H.D. Rouse quotes a Greek philosopher who described what he called a scene in any great city of Greece or Italy around 70 A.D. One may see in all the crowd and cram and crush everyone calmly doing his business. The piper teaching to pipe while the crowd passes by and does not interfere with him. The trainer producing his dancers for a stage play without noticing a few fights going on, and buying and selling and so forth, harping, painting pictures. I myself, he writes, saw all people doing all sorts of things, piping, dancing, one giving a show, one reciting a poem, one singing, one reading a story or a fable, and not one of them preventing anyone else from his own particular business. Something in this scene always struck me as quintessentially Western and forever unattainable in Russia. The ability of everyone to go his or her own way without supreme arbiters and enforcers of order and propriety in the business of living. Yet with the market busily burrowing the holes in the former Soviet monolith. And with the corrupt and disorganized state crumbling above, the Russians are beginning to be left alone to do as they please. A casual visitor to any Russian city now would observe people painting, cheating customers, playing harp, eating popcorn on the street, buying and selling the Russian Playboy, that's called Andrei, and the books of all the poets, begging, singing, or standing still on the sidewalk and gazing. Like a convalescing invalid, Russia is hobbling away from the prison hospital that the commissars and the czars built, with its lousy food, stern nurses, short visiting hours, and ugly uniforms. She's not out of the hospital yet, but she may be already unstoppable no matter what the high politics would be. As Gorbachev, who began this untethering of the civic society, used to say, "Процесс пошел," the process has started. In the past year and a half, Yeltsin has attempted all the revolutions nation builders tend to undertake, in politics, in the economy, in the structure of the state, and in its priorities in the outside world. All are unfinished. And should Yeltsin lose power, each and every one of these endeavors may be halted or even temporarily reversed. But as is often the case with true revolutionaries and true founding fathers, Yeltsin's most lasting contribution to a new Russia may turn out to be the one that is most difficult to objectify, quantify, and stamp out: the promulgation and sustenance of unsupervised life. Thank you. We'll take questions now, but remember that quote from Robert Louis Stevenson: "Today is the most obscure of all the epochs." So.
Dr. Aron, you mentioned in your lecture a few times that Yeltsin's political instincts have typically proved correct, and that he has survived. And in view of the recent developments at the Congress of People's Deputies, where Yeltsin failed to go to bat really for Gaidar, and essentially is living now with a prime minister who will most certainly slow down the reforms, if not reverse them to some degree. Do you think his instincts again have proved correct, or will prove correct?
Well, there is a certain amount of hope that he would still prove correct despite it all. But I agree with you. It is a cause of great concern. In fact, when I read the fine print of what happened, it seemed to me that it might be the first time in his political career that he has made one big error. If you look at what he has achieved, if the election of Chernomyrdin was a quid pro quo, and Yeltsin received in his turn a firm commitment to a referendum in April, and a more or less free hand in writing the question of that referendum, that may turn out to be a more or less adequate exchange. Anything that envisions Chernomyrdin as more than a transitional leader, transitional prime minister, spells a disaster. You might as well, well, in fact, I was about to say you might as well get Ryzhkov back, Gorbachev's first prime minister, but I must say that Ryzhkov would be an improvement over Chernomyrdin. You, in essence, received a state manager who, on top of everything else, comes from the oil industry, and most certainly was behind Yeltsin's decision not to liberate the prices of oil, an absolutely disastrous decision, because in addition to shortages and waste that artificially low prices always bring about, with the porous borders and the crumbling of political controls, Western Siberia, which is the home of Chernomyrdin, turned into a latter-day United Arab Emirates with managers of those state oil enterprises behaving like sheiks. They are exporting their own oil past the Soviet state. I mean, I'm sorry, the Russian state. Apparently, just in taxes, Russia loses about $1 billion a year from that contraband oil. That would only continue if Chernomyrdin begins, in fact, he said that he would probably reverse whatever liberation of prices did occur in the oil sector. It is a very strange choice. Yeltsin might have expended in vain a great deal of political capital. In this business of referenda, you cannot cry wolf too often. It is a powerful weapon, but it has to be done and reached for in the right context. Yeltsin first tells the parliament that he cannot work with it, that it's a nest of vipers, and that's just a milder version of what he said. Yet he comes back and he works with that parliament, and I'm afraid that you cannot go to the Russian people battered about, completely confused by what happened in the last 12 months, and ask them to go to defend their president on some minor constitutional issue. With referenda, you have to present things in very stark terms. And when I read the Yeltsin's first speech that led to it, he said everything right. He said, I cannot work with this parliament. The people have to choose between the president and the parliament. They have to choose between the reform and going back to the Soviet past. In his second speech, all of that got smudged. The lines are blurred. And again, unless we know something, unless we don't know, rather, something that Yeltsin does know, it seemed to me, again, a very strange error by a true master politician.
There was a story that a lot of that bad publicity for Yeltsin was generated by a campaign, organized campaign of the KGB at the request of Gorbachev. What are your comments on that?
Which campaign?
The campaign of saying Yeltsin's a drunk, all these bad things that came out in the Western press, that was generated, a lot of it behind the scenes by the KGB on behalf of Gorbachev.
Well, you also have, that's quite plausible. Nobody really proved that. There's no smoking gun. It's quite plausible. But you know, you don't really have to go to the KGB. The best thing to do is to go to who the sources for American journalists are in Moscow, the English speakers. Well, not only they have to be English speakers, but they also have to be English speakers who are not afraid to talk to American journalists. Well, until very recently, those were the people who were not afraid for a good reason. They didn't have to be afraid. They had a permission. And, well, the best example of that is our favorite Vladimir Posner. Here he is, Mr. Donohue's friend. It's to him that American journalists came. He told them that Yeltsin was a brute, a drunk, he cursed, he was really not nice to small children, and all of that. And all of that was verbatim translated because journalists need a story, and they need to file by a deadline. So you didn't really need to have a special KGB disinformation operation. It kind of unfolded.
What is your feeling about the current and future, the evolvement of the current political base and the future political base that Yeltsin has and will have? The Democrats are not happy. I saw Father Yakunin blasting Yeltsin, Timofeyev is blasting Yeltsin, and probably rightly so for accepting a man who voted with the rest of the Soviet government to support GKChP. To support the putsch in August of '91. So what is your feeling if the Democrats are isolated or Democrats don't accept what Yeltsin did and the former nomenclatura going with the Civic Union, who is his or who is going to be his power base?
Well, you see, until 2 days ago, I thought that Yeltsin's rebellion at the Congress was prompted precisely by those fears. I think his worst nightmare was to turn in a latter-day Gorbachev, become a president whose presidency is slowly drained of substance, turning into an empty shell to be tossed about or crushed. And I think Yeltsin decided to arrest that when he decided that he would go to people for a referendum. The byproduct of it would have been what you've just mentioned, galvanization and resuscitation of democratic Russia. The democratic Russia movement that's been put by Yeltsin on ice. There's no other term for that. And these types of movements, they're not petty parties. These types of movements exist for big things. A, they brought Yeltsin to power. They supported him. They got him the presidency. Then Yeltsin became the president. Then he became the ruler, and he told them to cool it. Well, those types of movements cannot really exist without moving. They began to crumble. As you know, democratic Russia split several ways. It is largely moribund. When Yeltsin rebelled at the Congress, there seemed to be a movement in the democratic Russia. All those veterans of democratic wars started crawling out of the woodwork and waving banners and so on. Then the retreat happened with Chernomyrdin. I think Yeltsin delivered a very serious blow to his credibility I don't think anybody doubts his democratic tendencies, but his credibility as a political leader of a democratic movement. It would be very difficult for him to go back to democratic Russia and ask them to bail him out if another crisis happens. So there was a chance to resuscitate democratic Russia. There was also another chance that I think might be lost. Again, depending on how the question on the referendum proceeds and is written. And that is that a very benign byproduct of a referendum followed by, again, on the de Gaulle model, followed by presidential elections and national elections on the top level and on the local level, would be finally giving some structure and muscle to the Russian political system that is entirely non-existent now. The Russian government is suspended in a vacuum in the center. Nothing exists on the local level. There are no mass parties. There are not even medium parties. Not that Russia needs to be politicized, God forbid, after all those years. But it needs some workable government, which is impossible without legitimacy, and that legitimacy could only be produced and tested by nationwide political elections. So unless in April we will see something like that, I believe not only the democratic Russia would be lost, but I think the chance to put certain amount of structure in the loose and crumbling political system that exists now in Russia would also be missed.
Your answer leads directly to my question. Assume the worst, that Yeltsin falls. Is from among the various alternatives, for example, perhaps ultra-nationalists coming to power, or ex-communists, or else perhaps ethnic disintegration on the Balkan model, what alternative do you think would be the most likely thing to follow Yeltsin's failure if he were to fail?
Well, I think the scenario would be like this. It's not, either the fascists or the Reds, what they call the Reds and the Browns, have much chance now. What I think might happen in the worst-case scenario is with Yeltsin present, but sort of emaciated politically, you would have the government of the Chernomyrdins, which, by and large, the civic union is full of absolutely incompetent people. They're, the former Soviet managers, and the only way they know how to work with the economy is by giving it more credits from the state. Well, at the rate now of 450 rubles to a dollar, that ruble, which the Russian wits now called a wooden ruble, would not take you that far, even if you wanted to issue those credits. So and clearly, by the way, Gaidar from the very beginning faced the choice between the Scylla of unemployment and Charybdis of hyperinflation. He wisely chose unemployment, which is still minuscule. I mean, it's 0.5%. in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary at the height of market reform was 15 to 20%. The civic union precisely on that score takes an opposite direction. Print money, give cheap credits, keep non-productive enterprises going, and rather hyperinflation than unemployment. Well, hyperinflation is the death of market reform. There's no incentive to work or produce. And every economist I spoke to thinks that they should choose, if they had to, unemployment rather than hyperinflation. So what I'm afraid will happen is that you'll have the government by the civic union, first Chernomyrdian, then somebody else, going on, until the hyperinflation reaches the level where it begins totally destruct the political system. I mean, it begins finally corrode whatever is left of political legitimacy. Then you have to be afraid of all those people that you mentioned. There will be an intermediate layer of the incompetence. Well, I call them incompetence. I wonder if in today's New York Times, on the op-ed page, I saw a terrific piece by a professor of economics from Amherst, University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Well, he says, we should not worry about Gaidar's gone. Chernomyrdian is just fine. Like Bill Clinton, he will give Russia state investment as opposed to the trickle-down economy that destroyed us here in the United States and that Gaidar implemented to destroy Russia. Well, I don't know. I mean, there are probably some people who will dissent from his opinion on what the trickle-down economy did here, but I can certainly tell you that issuing more state subsidies or credits, he wants state support for the Russian economy, when, as I said, you pay now 450 rubles for a dollar, and another thing from the Russian wits, they say they now give a pound of rubles for a pound sterling. In that sort of situation, what sort of credits, what sort of money are you going to give to those enterprises? But in any case, you know, apparently there are some people who feel that this is a wise course, and they reside in the University of Massachusetts.
Could you comment on that bizarre episode that was reported in the paper today, whereby the foreign minister made this aggressive speech, and then an hour later said it was a ruse?
I must say that it was too late to add to my list of normalization. See, my compatriots now begin to joke. This is a very important departure from the usually very solemn and dour kind of official presentation. I think it was a good thing that he did that. Apparently, Eagleburger was nearly prostrate and on the verge of a heart attack. Several ministers ran out to call their capitals to find out if there was a coup in Russia. So Kozyrev clearly impressed them. For those who didn't hear what transacted, Kozyrev, the foreign minister of Russia, speaking to the CSCE conference, delivered a speech that could have been written by Andropov, and delivered it completely deadpan. And of course, you know, people started falling off their chairs. They started calling their governments. The best one that I heard was, I think it was a consortium of correspondents that covered it, decided not to send that news to their newspapers because they were afraid that the financial markets begin to collapse. And so they withheld that information, and obviously they were right. So, and then an hour later, he came back and he said that it was all a joke. He said, I gave you the version of the speeches that you're likely to hear if Yeltsin falls. I think it was a very good scare. I must say that what Chernomyrdian represents for the economy is precisely what his buddies in the civic union would arrange for Russian national security and foreign policy. Again, in that article that Chris mentioned, I talk about Derzhavniki. That's a group that essentially thinks of foreign policy issues for the civic union, or close to it. And they're fairly tough bunch. You know, don't say yes all the time to the West. You know, Russia has its own interests, and so on and so forth. What, the joke? Well, from what I just read in the service that screens Russian television, they reported it without a comment, and it was a very kind of cryptic report of what Kozyrev did. So I believe that they decided not to disturb the populace already upset by what was happening. So I think it probably would not have much of an impact inside Russia, except to enrage the Soviet Union. I must say that does look to me like Kozyrev's swan song. I think he'll be out within a week or two, and we'll see a new foreign minister, and I tremble to imagine who that person would be. But if it would be the Chernomyrdin of foreign policy, I don't think we should look forward to that.
Hors d'oeuvres and beverages are in this corner of the room. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Leon, thank you for a magnificent and moving lecture.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thanks.
That was terrific.
Thank you.
Do you have copies of that, or are they just notes?
Well, a lot of